gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage international broadcaster Zena Badawi.
Hello again. Very nice to see you all, and I hope you've been suitably energized and refreshed by a very excellent lunch. I certainly did justice to it. So we've got our first session after the afternoon here in the plenary, and this is going to be exploring the tools of the trade, how nations are attracting business, tourism and investment. So we have a wonderful ministerial panel for you who are going to be giving you their perspectives and sharing their insights and their knowledge about what kind of policies they are undertaking in their countries to attract business, tourism and investment. So all ministers and all gentlemen, as you can see, and your names are there. So thank you very much indeed. Stephen Chobo, you are Minister for Tourism, Trade and Investment in Australia. And, but you've also had a career in the private sector a while back, but you've also served as your country's governor on a host of international financial institutions like the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the African Development Bank. So you've got a very good kind of overview of how countries go about attracting business, tourism and investment. So just to kick off a question to you, apart from what you're doing in Australia, do you think that there are universal principles that govern how a country should go about attracting these sectors, regardless of where they are in the world and regardless of what stage of development they're in?
Look, I certainly do. And from my perspective, one of the most common phrases we've heard both here at this conference, but also you'll hear around the world, is best summed up by that word risk. Businesses, of course, want to mitigate risk as much as possible, and any government that wants to be commercially focused, that wants to provide the right policy framework, and that wants to not only entice investment from the private sector into key priority areas, but also ensure that reputationally that they maximise those opportunities, needs to focus on risk. And risk is a combination of things. From a policymaker's perspective, there's issues around sovereign risk, but there's also, of course, the risks around the commercial aspects of a deal. So from Australia's perspective, we put a lot of focus on trying to minimise sovereign risk, which means that people can have confidence that if they're going to invest into Australia, that they'll know that there's a low sovereign risk profile. We're not going to shift the goalposts. We're not going to make radical changes to policy or to regulation, which will impact on especially investments that have longer term timeframes. So if I was to say, well, what is the common thread that runs through those commercial decisions in any jurisdiction, it comes back to risk.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'll come to you in Africa there. Eukario Bakale Angwe Oyana, Minister from Equatorial Guinea for the economy and planning and investment. How do you see it in Africa? Because obviously the kind of stability and consistency of policies that Stephen Chobo has just referred to, people often say are lacking in Africa, and that surely must be the first building block you need to put in place in order to attract investment.
I think we just had an interesting conversation about Africa in your previous panel. And I think Africa has different challenges, as we pointed out. There cannot be a universal set of rules to attract investment, to attract high-end companies and technology. We have to address the key challenges that Africa faces. And these key challenges, I think, are different from the challenges that Australia or countries in Europe and North America or Southeast Asia are facing. We still have a big gap in infrastructure, both in hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure we talked early on. We still have a gap in education. and we also have a gap in business climate. But most importantly, I think that you can have all the infrastructure of the world, you can have a good macroeconomic framework, but if we don't have peace and stability, then businesses will not come. So Africa has to resolve the issue of stability, peace and stability first, focus on infrastructure, focus on education and skill building, even though Africa is blessed with demographics, but it's also true that this workforce is the less skilled workforce in the world. So we have to put more emphasis on being innovative in education, in forming and training our people. This massive opportunity, window of opportunity that we have in terms of demographics will not be realized if these people are not skilled. So these are the challenges for Africa in order to attract business, and particularly for my country, Equatorial Guinea.
So you need to make sure that you have a properly educated workforce, but more than that, that they are equipped with the skills that are needed to fill the kind of jobs that the economy needs in order to develop and therefore also attract investment.
That's correct, because besides infrastructure, the second most, I would say, challenge that a lot of companies talked about when they work in Africa is the lack of skill set of the labor force. So we invest in infrastructure, but we have to be very innovative in education. It's not anymore the case of providing access to education. It's providing access to education that would serve for the future needs of the country and the future of the economy.
Lim Heng Kiang, you are the Minister for Trade and Industry in Singapore. What is your nation doing to try to boost these areas?
Well, basically, I think every country has to establish certain basic fundamentals, and that's making sure the infrastructure, the education, the logistics serves the country and the business as well. Then you have to see yourself as part of a regional and a bigger context. So in Singapore's case, we are part of the Association of Southeast Asia Nations, or ASEAN, and we are embarking on this regional integration, bringing the 10 countries of ASEAN together as one single market and a single production base. So Singapore works with our colleagues in ASEAN to try and raise the productivity of our regional value chain. And so we are able to present a bigger value proposition, not just individually, but also collectively.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because of course we know that the Southeast Asian nations, when you look at other groupings in the world, they do have a relatively high economic integration. They trade a lot with one another. So is your model then, when you're discussing this question about attracting more investment and business opportunities, that you are looking more at a regional level, that you are less concerned with global capital from beyond the ASEAN region?
Not at all. In fact, we pursue both collectively as well as extra-regionally. The trade intra-ASEAN is only about 20-something%, so it's still not as high as the intra-regional trade of EU. And that's because all the ASEAN economies are relatively open economies. So we not just trade among ourselves, but we also trade with the world. So the global perspective is also very important. We don't look inwards regionally. I think we are integrating regionally, but we also want to work globally with other countries in the world. So it's
pursuing the two in tandem.
Oh, that's right.
Mm-hmm. Raed Houri, you're the Minister for Trade and the Economy in Lebanon. And just picking up on the point about stability and consistency in policy and so on, we obviously know that the system of government in Lebanon is one where consensus building can be quite difficult to achieve. So from your perspective, it's very important, isn't it, that you have to have consensus building. So how do you go about doing that when it comes to dealing with the topic that we're discussing?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Lebanon is a small country, and I can tell you for a fact that it is the oldest democracy in the region. And this is good and bad at the same time. Good because we know that democracies create more efficiencies, create more stability, but bad because we need a lot of consensus from all political parties for any kind of decision that we need to take. But we've been able to overcome all these difficulties over the years. You know, Lebanon has been suffering since many, many years. It goes back to 100 years of many problems and wars. First, because it is the location of Lebanon is critical in the Middle East, and then we had a history of political tensions. Yet we were able to survive, and this is what the most important thing that Lebanon is distinguished about, and Lebanese. We consider ourselves the most resilient country in terms of economy and security. And the latest problem we have, major problem, is the Syrian refugees which flooded Lebanon. And we have the highest ratio in the world of refugees over the existing population. And I had a intervention in the World Bank last week, and I gave an example. It's like all Mexican people flood to the USA at one time. So what could the economy react? But we are very resilient. We've proven to be all investors that came and invested money in Lebanon, especially in the real estate sector, in the banking sector, and in telecommunication. They have made money over the years, and they have not lost money. So briefly, this is our situation. Then I can talk more.
Sure, we will, yeah. I just want to get everybody's opinion at first, and then I want to ask the audience a question as well, which we'll test opinion in the audience here. But Keming Chen, you are the Vice Minister for Commerce in the People's Republic of China. So China is taking new steps to develop its economy, moving very much from the traditional way we've seen it, which is a low-wage, manufacturing, export-orientated, relatively low productivity economy, to a high-wage, high-productivity, technologically driven market economy, which also is very, very keen on developing the service sector. So just tell us what steps you're taking to develop this kind of transformation in your economy.
Well, for the last few years, China, against the backdrop of the sluggish world economy, we have put in place the new concept of the development, featuring the innovation, coordination, green growth, openness, and the sharing, and this guidelines. We have introduced a package of macroeconomic policies, including the more positive physical policies and the more prudent monetary policies. We aim to stabilize the economic growth while create new jobs and promoting the structural reform. So far, I think the macroeconomic policy framework works very well. For the first 3 quarters of this year, the Chinese economy grew by 6.9%, much higher than the world average. And also the structural reform and the effect of the structural reform is very obvious. China is shifting from a pattern of heavily rely on the resources, as you said, and the labor-intensive industry, the export, the investment, to a pattern of economy driven by the innovations. So for the last year, I think the service have contributed more than 0.5% of the GDP growth. And the consumption is also growing very high, and it's account for 30% of the growth in China. Meanwhile, we have forged out a very ambitious plan. We call the Made in China 2025. We identified 10 priority areas, such as...
You're not going to give us all 10, are you now?
Yeah, okay, yes.
Are you? Maybe just the most important ones,
okay.
not the list of 10.
Just very few, such as the new generation of information technology, new energy cars, and biomedicine, and so on. So we want to, move from the labor-intensive, low-end industry to high-end and innovation.
High productivity,
yes.
Innovative
yes.
development. Yeah, very interesting. Just very quickly, before I come to the audience to just ask this one question. Everybody knows that China invests so much money all over the world, not just in Africa, but Latin America, Europe, Asia.
Yes.
And so why does China want to attract investment when you've obviously got so much money to invest? Why don't you just put it all in things that you need in China?
The foreign direct investment has played a very important role in fostering China's economic growth, as well as the reform, the structure of the reform. So the Chinese government is continuing to attract more investment into China, I think. We do invest a lot in Africa, in Australia, and in other countries. I think from last year, we have strengthened the authentication review of the outbound investment because we want to curb the outbound investment and put them more into the real economy rather than to buying the football clubs or other assets,
Got it.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, audience, I want to ask you a question. You've got some choices of answers in terms of if, as a nation, you want to attract business and investment to your countries, which do you think are the most important policies you should focus on? So, number one, actually take your mobile phone, get the app up, and press the buzzer. Number one, offer incentive packages. 2, invest in new infrastructures. 3, invest in culture and entertainment. 4, increase business partnerships. And 5, invest in education. So press your buttons, and then at the end of this session, we'll see whether opinion has shifted in the light of what you've heard our panel say. You might be interested to see what the results are. Can you see them from there?
Yeah.
Yes.
Your eyesight's good enough, chaps? Very good. But I will announce it anyway. So, no clear winner between the top two. Invest in new infrastructure gets 26.9, and increase business partnerships 30.8%, actually. And then you've got offer incentive packages 15.4%, the same for invest in culture and entertainment, and then last of all, invest in education. Interesting. So, let's just test the propositions there. So clearly, offering incentive packages and tax breaks is not enough, is it? Does anybody want to pick up on that?
I think
right, Fori?
Yeah, I think it's very important for the tax incentive and other kind of incentives that governments can offer, such as, for example, land tax incentives and other incentives, because after all, investors would like to know the return on equity directly, and this will have a greater effect. But definitely, this is not the only one, as the audience has already addressed. Infrastructure is very important; it's basic, and that's what we want to do in Lebanon. We want to do the first two. We have plans for infrastructure, which is about $12 to $13 billion to be launched. And we are going to undergoing a macro sectorial plan whereby we will set all the tools and all the incentives to attract foreign investment in these sectors.
Minister Bakali, are you surprised by what the audience said? Only 11% invest in education, because picking up what Vice Minister Chen said, which is that you need innovation and technologically driven development, and you need a relatively well-educated workforce in order to be able to do those innovative jobs and so on. Do you think that they should have put more emphasis on education?
Yes, I was a bit surprised, because I think education leads to business development and business creation. Nowadays, in the discussions, in the framework of the discussion we've been having, as yesterday when we talk about new technologies, we see that businesses follow knowledge nowadays. Whenever there is knowledge, business go. We see the development in India and China, how the development in the educational sector and the skill building made a lot of companies go to India and go to China. So I think infrastructure is key, but it's not enough. I think we should put more emphasis into education, into providing health services for the people, because you have to educate people, but also people need to have good health. We have the example of my country, Equatorial Guinea. We invested since 2007, we invested a lot since we are an oil producer. We use a lot of our oil resources in investing in infrastructure. I think in sub-Saharan Africa, if we are not the top in basic infrastructure, we should be the second country in sub-Saharan Africa with the best infrastructure in terms of road, airports, ports. But that has not been enough in attracting businesses because we still have a lot of difficulties, foremost in education, and a lot of difficulties in regulation, government regulation, to create a business environment that is proper for business development. So I was expecting a lot more emphasis on education, particularly maybe because a lot of the people that are in the room are not from Africa. I think Africa has a particularity because it doesn't play in the same league as the other continents. When I talk mostly about Africa instead of Equatorial Guinea, because I think some of the shortfalls we have in Equatorial Guinea are also the shortfalls that the continent as a whole has. So education for me, I think is key for Africa. When people are educated and they have the skill set, they will be entrepreneurs, they will create businesses.
It's important for everyone, even for people in this region. Not just primary and secondary, but also tertiary. And then, as we said earlier on, you've got to educate people in the skills that economies need. Minister Kiang, though, infrastructure really featured a great deal, and that's very much the bedrock of the kind of things that ASEAN countries are trying to do in order to encourage the regional integration that you said they are trying to pursue. So for you, is that the key area, sector, that you would wish to attract business and investment?
I think the results are self-explanatory, and in the case of ASEAN, because we lay great emphasis on regional integration and connectivity, so we do promote investments in infrastructure. I suspect the audience gave lower weightage to education, not because it's not important, but they expect the governments themselves to be the ones primarily responsible for investing in education. They expect when they enter a country to find the labor force reasonably educated and trained. And that is in fact the strategy pursued by Singapore. Together with our tripartite partners, the companies as well as the unions, the Singapore government lays great stress not just on pre-employment training, but also lifelong training and upgrading during the worker's career. And I think that is what investors especially, and also all those in the audience would expect the role of the government to do.
We know about the great Singaporean education system and how you score so well on all these OECD indicators. An interesting factor, though, is apparently girls in Singapore do better on maths than the boys in Singapore.
I think our girls do
right?
better in many areas than boys.
Oh, we like that. We ladies like that, Minister. Thank you very much. Good. Minister Chen, I mean, interestingly enough, again, the audience thought that there was a lot of scope to invest in culture, and obviously that's an important cornerstone when it comes to talking about tourism. So does China think about its investments abroad in terms of looking at culture, the arts at all? Is that something that you might be considering?
Yes, we do attach a great importance to the cultural exchanges. For example, in the Belt and Road initiatives, we have the infrastructure connectivity, but we also have the cultural exchanges. So, and between China and the African countries, we have a lot of cultural exchange activities. And also with the Asian countries, you know, we hold a lot of activities every year for people to exchange their culture. And also China has signed a lot of memorandum or contract with other countries to set that country as a tourism destination for Chinese, you know. For last year, the Chinese people going abroad, the number is about 100 million, you know.
Really?
So it's very huge. So now we are continue to work to make efforts to encourage people to go abroad.
Yeah. I'll talk about tourism in a minute, but I was just thinking, you know, obviously China invests a lot in Nigeria and in Nigerian agriculture, but the creative industries, Nollywood, films and so on, are about the same share of GDP as the creative industry, the agriculture. Yeah, they're similar. Yeah, so we might see Chinese finance of Nigerian films, maybe, who knows? Just a thought, just a thought. Stephen Chobo, Minister Chen just raised the issue of tourism. So, of course, that is part of the service sector. It's a very, very good source of foreign currency for countries that, that do have strong tourism sectors. So when it comes to attracting investment in tourism, what do you think matters?
Well, if I look at the results there, it's a combination of things. Again, to speak about the Australian experience, a clear vision about what the government's intentions are in the sector. So they want to know that there's a growth trajectory there. They want to see the provision of infrastructure that will help, especially if you've got reliance, as Australia does, of course, on long-haul tourism. As everyone knows, Australia is a fair distance from everywhere, but getting closer every year. That means that they want to see facilitation of passengers. They want it to be relatively seamless, good air connectivity. We've put a lot of focus on putting in place liberalised air services agreements between Australia and as many countries as possible. In fact, just in December, Australia and China mainland's most liberalised air services agreement they've ever entered into. So now there's 21 cities in China with direct access to Australia. So that's another crucial factor. They want to know that they'll be able to get the labour force that they need. People with language skills, people with hospitality training, the chefs, the cooks, those that can provide a quality visitor experience. And they also want to know that in terms of investment in the tourism space, that you'll overcome the free rider principle, which the tourism industry is burdened with, which means that you'll have a centralised marketing effort to bring international tourists from around the world to that destination. Because otherwise, if you just have a reliance on one major hotel, for example, marketing a destination, there can be 10 others that never invest a cent in marketing efforts who enjoy that free rider principle. So it's the ability to also pool funds on an aggregate basis to draw the crowds.
I mean, I know you're not ministers of tourism exactly, but in terms of attracting tourists, the role of the city is very important in a country, isn't it? And you've got to have cities that work properly in terms of transport. And when you're thinking about, you know, planning your cities or developing them or transforming them even, you have to think about how you use the city so that visitors can have a good experience. So transport, you know, are you building roads for pedestrians, for car drivers, or for public transport and so on, and then sanitation and services that have to work properly. So I don't really want to comment on that, the importance of getting your cities right to attract tourists to come. Right, Hori?
I mean, sure, but first of all, every country has to decide what are the target market for the country in terms of tourism, and then try to cater for these kind of tourists. So it depends if they are targeting tourism for sea and beaches, or tourism for any other issues. But at the same time, yes, without a nice infrastructure, without nice roads, with good restaurants, nice atmosphere, and especially the culture of the receiving country, of the people, has to be open to attracting tourists, because tourists would like to be welcomed well and to be treated in a very good manner. So this also plays a major role as well.
Mm. Minister Ricardo?
Yeah, I think what is the product for tourism? There are two main products. First one is culture, and second one is leisure. I think what we need to pay attention is that our cities, they shouldn't get too advanced so that we forget about the culture, the real product that we're selling to tourists. So we need to keep in mind in designing the cities of the future, or designing the city in order to attract tourism, that the people that are coming to visit the countries, the first thing they want to get exposed to is our way of life. So we need to be able to preserve that while we're designing for the cities for the future. Leisure, you can get it anywhere. You can have fun here, you can have fun anywhere, but why do I decide to come to Saudi Arabia and not go to Equatorial Guinea? Is the culture. I think is the first product that we need to take into account while considering a strategy for tourism.
Mm. What is EG, what is Equatorial Guinea doing in terms of tourism? Because I mean, a lot of African countries have done very well out of it. You know, obviously the safari, you know, Rwanda with its gorilla trek, and you know, a very, very important source of revenue. Is Equatorial Guinea doing very much at all in that, on your radar?
We would be foolish if we don't invest in tourism. What we've done in the last 10 years, I always have to remind everyone that probably 15 years ago, no one knew where Equatorial Guinea was, and no one, because we were the poorest country in Africa 15 years ago. But
you should be one of the richest now.
Yes.
What are you, about 1 million people, 1.2 million?
Yeah, 1.2 million
and
people.
how much oil do you produce a day? Something like 300,000 barrels a day?
Yes, exactly.
That's a lot of money for a small number of people. A lot of barrels.
Exactly. That's why we have invested that money in the last 10 years in actually building the infrastructure. But because that's the key. When you talk to people, development banks, they say, okay, or businessmen, they said the first priority for Africa is to build infrastructure. That's what we did. We invested heavily in infrastructure, and also infrastructure for tourism, hotels, roads, and everything. And now I think the key thing that we're working on is initiative to better improve the environment, the business environment of the country.
So what do you want people to come in, build hotels with you? And
we have actually invested in huge hotels. What we want now is to change the mentality, because every time we talked about Africa, we talk about risk, we talk about stability, we talk about political instability. And my country has a long history of political stability. So we want to change the mindset of people about Equatorial Guinea in particular, but about Africa also in general.
Mm. Minister Chen, so we've talked about tourism. I think everybody agrees that investment in tourism, you've got to have some infrastructure and some stability. So, and obviously, every country's got some good points that you can attract visitors. And internal tourism is also a very, very important thing, particularly for a country like Australia that is, as you say, quite far for a lot of places. But so that's why we've understood that. But just picking up again on infrastructure, which seems to be the very, very important factor in attracting investment. Minister Chen, obviously China with its One Belt, One Road initiative, which is really just reaching out all over the world. I mean, I think that something like 20 Chinese cities are connected to Europe through direct rail links.
Right.
Right, so, you know, and Germany is China's biggest trading partner. Yes. So you're obviously looking, you know, beyond the region. Just tell us, you know, what can we expect from the One Belt, One Road initiative? What kind of actions are you planning?
Well, China's pressing ahead with the Belt and Road initiative. With the principle of joint construction, joint contribution, extensive consultation, and the shared benefits. So, for last 3 years, the initiative have got great advances. In last year, by the end of last year, the Chinese companies have built up about 46 trade and economic cooperation zone along the Belt and Road countries. And the accumulated investment in these countries reached over 18.5 billion US dollars. And this year, the number is still increasing. I think that's create a lot of opportunity for the countries along the Belt and Road to improve their infrastructure and also to build up industrial production capacities and create a lot of jobs and contribute a lot of export or revenue, financial revenues. I think especially in the backdrop of the sluggish economy, it provides a new engine for the world economy to recover.
Good.
Yes.
Well, you heard it here first. That's the vision there. Minister, obviously Singapore, a very advanced economy. Just, you know, in the context of our discussion today, which industries do you see as the kind of industries of the future? We've heard, obviously, the importance of innovation.
Well, we have taken a very diversified strategy in our economic development approach. We still believe that manufacturing remains an important sector for us to continue to promote. Manufacturing contributes about 20% of our GDP, and we try to maintain that share because it generates very good paying jobs, stable jobs, and highly technical jobs. So we still continue to develop our capabilities in manufacturing, addressing possible technological disruptions, and try to incorporate and stay ahead of the curve by incorporating new technologies like advanced manufacturing, robotics, and the use of digital analysis in the approach towards manufacturing processes. But services sector is very important in Singapore, and we have several key services sectors, financial services, business services, logistics, wholesale and trading services. And that takes advantage of our location and our position as a hub for Southeast Asia as well as for Asia Pacific. So for each country, I think they have to work on your economic strategy that capitalizes on your competitive advantage, and then work together with your corporate partners, with your trade unions in executing the plan. I think the key, especially without using jargon, is execution.
You mentioned also partners, local partners. I mean, often people do complain that if they go to a country that they haven't invested in before, that there aren't just good local partners or ones that they know of who they can actually work with. I mean, Minister Bakali, that's often something that you hear international business people say, in particular about African countries, you know, who are the local partners we can work with? And then you find that people just coalesce around a very small number of tried and tested local partners.
Yeah. I think that will continue to be a challenge as long as we still view the continent as a high-risk continent that we don't want to go to unknown. I think there are a lot of entrepreneurs and some wealth design and develop businessmen and businesses in Africa. The key thing is that you have to go to Africa in order to discover local partners. You cannot find local partners in Europe, African local partners from sitting in an office in Europe. You have to go to Africa in order to find those partners. There are challenges, but I think we have already. Today we saw a very successful young businessman from Nigeria, Mr. Tinubu, and we know others that are doing well in the private sector. So I think they are there, but we have to take the risk to actually go to Africa if we can consider that to be a risk. If we can go to the moon, what is riskier? Something you know or something you don't know? We know Africa, we know the risk. Do we know the moon? Do we know the risk that we would face in the moon? So I think if it's considered a risk, then why not take the risk and actually visit the continent and find the partners that you need?
Mm. But, you know, people always say, oh, they encounter so many obstacles to investment. You've got the bureaucracy, you've got, you know, insufficient regulatory frameworks, and people just don't have the confidence, which is why when people talk about investing in Africa, they just tend to go to South Africa and sometimes now Nigeria, and that is about it. So there's a lot for the public sector, for the government and the ministers to get right, to give that reassurance, because I think we said earlier on that, you know, private equity does go in for high risk, but not in unstable areas. Just to round up, really, all of you, to give us your parting shots. So when we're talking about how nations attract investment in business, in tourism, and so on, what, you know, you have to have a policy for now and also for the future as well. And so what do you think are you know, the key steps or the key things? It goes back to the question I asked you at the beginning, Steve, really, you know, what do you need that really transcends, you know, a country's requirements regardless of where you are? But, you know, what would be your parting shot? Are you all right, Raid Houri? You're trying. Do you want to cough a bit more and then I'll come to you, or are you okay? Shall I give you more water? Could you give him more water?
Sorry, because I have flu.
Yeah,
sure.
You give him more water.
So, you know, there is a global problem that are facing most of the countries, which is the fatigue in fiscal policies. Most of the countries, they cannot anymore spend money in investment, except China, maybe. And therefore, this trend will put pressure on all governments to consider attracting private sector. And if you look at Saudi Arabia, which is a wealthy oil-producing country, is going to that direction. So let alone other countries. Having said this, we as Lebanon, we are aware of that. And we are putting in place all the conditions to attract these investors. And I think one example that Singapore has done very good and they have been successful, and I think most of the countries can follow, is creating a free economic zones with new rules and regulations, and what you said about bureaucracies, so you can avoid all bureaucracies. Because an investor would like to come and avoid these kinds of bureaucracies. By doing free economic zones, you can put in place new, fresh policies and procedures that are not related to the legacy of the government and all the bureaucracies. And then you can put the tax incentives, you can put all kinds of incentives to attract capital into these free economic zones. And then also you can export, you can promote exports and logistics. This is exactly what Singapore has done. And we, as in Lebanon, we are following these steps, especially that we have a golden opportunity now, which is the reconstruction of Syria coming in the next years. And we, Lebanon, geographically and culturally, we are ready, we will be ready to grab this opportunity, and we invite all investors to come and partner with us, partner with the government, and partner with the Lebanese private sector.
Minister Kiang, though, just mindful of what I've been saying, which is, of course, you want to attract investment and so on, but you've got to make sure that private sector involvement is also consistent with the national objectives and ambitions of a government to deliver for its citizens as well, so that you achieve sustainable, inclusive growth where there aren't, rising gaps of inequality. So you've got to make sure, from your point of view, that yes, you're satisfying the business community, attracting them with the right incentives, but they are also acting in a way which is consistent with your government objectives.
I think that's absolutely true, because you have to have a vision that is attractive to foreign investors, but also a vision that your citizens subscribe to and vote the government in to execute. And once you have that vision and the alignment, then what you need to do, number one, is to build trust and preserve the trust among all the partners, whether it's government, the companies, or the trade unions. And most importantly of all, in the end, is execution. You must execute the vision and the plans well, and through that careful execution, continue to build on the trust that you have developed.
So Stephen Chiobo, in answering this question, as did at the beginning, attracting investment to a country as a nation, you have got to do what the Minister from Singapore has just said, which is you've got to make sure there's a kind of social contract almost between the government, the trades unions or the employees, and business, the private sector, so that it is something which is of mutual benefit.
Absolutely. People look for they'll look at a risk-weighted return, so they want to know what is the actual consequence of...
I don't know what's happening there.
Try?
Yeah.
Audio out there or no?
Maybe if I come closer to you. Oh, that one there.
This one? There we go. Got two, a backup.
Yeah.
What I was saying is that what matters is a risk-weighted return. So part of Australia's appeal, I think, breaks down to several things. One, we are the only developed economy in the world that's had 26 years of continuous economic growth. The reason, as a developed economy, we've been able to achieve that is because of a consistent effort that's made by centre-right and centre-left governments in Australia to undertaking the economic reform necessary to keep our economy growing. With that backdrop, we then can put an overlay on that where people have a sense of the vision of the direction we're going in, can have faith that they can invest in Australia, and when you bring into account the risk and weight your return on the basis of risk, even though Australia as a smaller market of 23, 24 million people, but one of the highest per capita GDP rates, it still represents a terrific investment opportunity, albeit perhaps with lower returns, but with much lower levels of risk. So when you weight that, I think that provides incentive. So we've seen a really strong inflow of FDI and more broadly portfolio investment into Australia. As Investment Minister, I try to be as welcoming of that as possible. We seek to provide investor certainty by, as I said, reducing our sovereign risk profile as low as possible, and then ultimately share with them through a highly motivated, agile workforce and a commitment to providing a return that will reflect that level of investment, an environment where people will say, look, I've got a choice between where I want to park my capital. I want to park my capital in Australia because it's got low sovereign risk, certainty in terms of legal frameworks, and it's a good exposure to what is effectively an Asia growth play more generally that Australia can tap into because of the trade deals we've done with China, with Korea, Japan and Singapore.
Vice Minister, just in your closing comment, I know you wanted to mention something about China's increasing links, economic links with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We know that you get more and more of your oil now from Saudi Arabia. So maybe just give us your closing remark on that burgeoning relationship.
Yesterday I have a very good meeting with my counterpart here in Saudi Arabia, the Vice Minister of the Ministry of Commerce and Investment. For moving forward, we want to enhance the exchange of the entrepreneurs and the companies, private sectors between the two countries. We have identified some priorities areas such as the energy, the petrochemicals, infrastructure and industrial park, you know. So I think in the near future, with both the efforts from the both side, I believe that the cooperation between the two countries will be deepened, and we will deliver more benefits for the people in the two countries.
Mm-hmm. And finally, Minister Bakali, so you said, don't mind the infrastructure gap, we're doing something about that, but can you reassure people that the business climate in Equatorial Guinea is right to make it a business destination?
Well, I cannot say it's a perfect business environment, but we're working on it. That's why we continue to work to improve it. And, but in order to do so, we need also the leadership of the business community, because governments need to be pushed by the private sector. If the private sector doesn't give the effort to actually push government to do reforms, I mean, it's the obligation for government to do reform, but also when we have the pressure of the private sector, a lot of things can move quicker. So we're working on it, and what I can guarantee is that Equatorial Guinea of 5 years ago is not the same Equatorial Guinea of today, and we hope that in 5 years or 2 years or 3 years, it will be much better.
Thank you very much, Neil. Let's just see where the audience stand on the questions I asked at the beginning. Can I ask you to vote again? Pull out your mobile phones and see. So what should policymakers, ministers do most to attract business and investment to their countries? 1, offer incentive packages to invest in new infrastructure. 3, invest in culture and entertainment. 4, increase business partnerships. And 5, invest in education. If you could vote now, thank you. Let's see if opinion has shifted. So, things have shifted a bit. Invest in new infrastructure has gone wild. It's gone to 50%, and incentive packages has gone down to 8.3%. Increased business partnerships has gone down to, you have swayed opinion. You've doubled the number of people who've said invest in education. I think that's down to you, Minister Bakali. And offer incentive packages, yes, that's also gone down. So interesting, you clearly were paying attention to what the ministers were saying, that you have changed your minds. It's very good when you can have a debate and you start off with an opinion at the beginning and at the end of it you change your mind. I think we've touched an awful lot of areas here. I hope you have found it as interesting as I have. Thank you very much indeed to my panel, and thank you to you also for your kind attention, and I wish you every success in all your endeavours, and I hope you have an enjoyable conference for the rest of the time. From me, goodbye. Thank you.